we'll tie these together and illustrate it through the use of karst processes and carbonate terrains. And I think you'll see that those are ideal terrains to look at the dramatic impacts of both of these. As you heard, John Mills actually carried out a lot of the research, and many of the concepts were very well articulated in his Master of Science thesis. So if you're interested in getting into more depth of it, why, you can look at John's thesis. What I'm going to do is give you a very brief resume of some of the work that John did and also show you some examples from around the country and around the world that pertain to the topic. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about before I show you some slides is the concept of transient storage. And this is a new idea in terms of application to Wyoming. It's not particularly new elsewhere. It has been thought of before. But what we're concerned about is blocks of rocks that are clearly uplifted well above regional aquifers that are taking a lot of recharged water during the spring melt and putting it in a storage. And then that storage leaks off during the rest of the year. And this has ramifications because obviously what we're talking about is one more capacitor in a hydrologic system that hasn't been well described, particularly in the Wyoming environment. Let me show you a little idea about what we mean by this transient storage. For example, if I take a Wyoming uplift like so, and we have a block of rocks that are clearly above the zone of saturation. And then down here we have our basins. And in the basin we might have something like a Madison Aquifer. This will be fully saturated to the perimeter of the basin. But up here is a block of rocks that's very well drained. And if we put a snow cap on this or introduce a lot of precipitation on this, the tendency of these sedimentary rocks will be to absorb recharge and put it into storage. And we'll develop a zone of saturation in there that will clearly be at its highest during the snow melt, and it'll bleed off for the rest of the year. And this thing will leak water down gradient towards the basins. The important thing about this transient storage is that we're looking at blocks of rocks that fill and empty on a cyclic basis. And consequently, they have been largely overlooked in the Wyoming environment. If this block of rocks is a block of granite, then very little will go in because of low permeabilities, and it'll run right off at the beginning of the year. But what we're interested in are sedimentary rocks that have the ability to soak up a lot of recharge and put water into storage. And when we take a look at these limestone terrains, you're seeing terrains that have a fantastic ability to put water into storage and leak it off. The ramifications or the implications of this transient storage phenomena are major. The most important to surface water hydrologists is that these transient storage systems help retard runoff during the early spring. And what this translates into is prolonged recessions in streams. And when we take a look at streams with long recession rates, such as some coming out of the Teton-Grovon area, or the Bighorn area, if they're running well into the fall, you're really talking about water coming out of these transient storage zones. Another thing that they do, by lengthening the discharge period along the flank of the range, what they do is they promote the recharge into the deep basins. And the way this occurs is you simply have a longer period of discharge from the range over the critical recharge areas for the deep basin aquifers, or there might be hydraulic linkages between the two. And what you end up getting is a prolonged recharge event, whereas if it was coming off a granite terrain, it would only last a couple of weeks while the streams were flooding. So this is an important aspect. One of the negatives about this transient storage phenomenon is that these aquifers tend to be extremely permeable and very quick responding. So that if you have the introduction of pollutants in these upstream regions, those pollutants move rapidly through the system. And a lot of people are utilizing springs, at least ephemeral springs in some instances, from these areas, and they're highly susceptible to pollution because you get it the same season that you put it in. So this is one of the big concerns. Now, what I'd also like to develop for you is the idea of pulse-through versus flow-through phenomena, and these terrains are particularly appropriate to talk about it. When we talk about flow-through, what we're talking about is the annual recharge event moving through the aquifer at the same rate at which the water moves through the aquifer. So if we have a recharge event in an upstream area, and we watch the passage of the hydraulic head pulse that's associated with that recharge event, what we see is the hydraulic pulse move down through the aquifer, and it will arrive at the downstream springs at the same time that the recharged water does. And that's the flow-through event. Flow-through is a very rare occurrence in general in hydrogeology because the water generally goes into storage in the upstream parts of the aquifers, and the hydraulic pulse passes through the aquifer, pushing older water out downstream. Now in that situation, we've called this pulse-through. What we're talking about there is an aquifer where you recharge water into the aquifer at the upstream end, you raise water levels, we call that a hydraulic pulse, a recharge pulse, and that raised water level pulse will move through the aquifer at a rate much greater than the flow of the water because the permeabilities are small, and it'll arrive down at the downstream springs, causing the springs to discharge at a higher rate, so you'll get a nice seasonal fluctuation in the spring, but the actual water coming out the spring is old water that's lost from storage in the downstream part of the aquifer. That's the pulse-through event. Now, in these karst areas, we typically have a combination of both events. The high permeable conduits that are available in karst allow for flow-through events, and then the intercrystalline fracture permeability and other permeability associated with the aquifer will also allow for pulse-through phenomena because we're moving water through storage in lower permeable zones. So we can get both occurring. Now, to help you with some of this stuff, I prepared a handout with a few of these definitions, and many of these are out of John's thesis. I don't have enough. I made 20 of these, so maybe somebody might like to make a few more. But is there somebody around that can run some copies of these, Tom?
I don't know, whatever.
Well, we can get some.
Not getting one from here, this in the building. We can get some run.
Yeah, we'll get Pete. Okay, what I'd like to bring to your attention now that you have an idea of what we're talking about, I'll show you some slides with all of this. What I'd like to talk about are some phenomenally permeable parts of these transient storage zones that we have here in Wyoming and elsewhere. And what we're looking at in many cases are uplifted blocks of, in Wyoming, Paleozoic limestones. And we're interested in the transient storage characteristics of these limestones. In order to have transient storage, of course, we have to have some permeability in which we can put the water. And we want permeability that interconnects with the surface so we get some decent recharge rates. And the carbonates are particularly nice for this because they develop karst systems that do the job for us. And there are two broad classes of karst that we might mention, and both of these are interconnected. They're not isolated from each other. One is called epikarst, and then there's the deep-seated karst. Epikarst derives its name from epi, which of course means superficial or on the surface, like epidermis, that's your skin. Epikarst is simply a zone of interconnected solution cavities and fractures, very intricately tied together, that have propagated downward from the exposed surface. These things have large permeabilities. I think I'll be able to convince you of that with some slides. And they accept large amounts of recharged water during the snowmelt period and during the spring rains, and they have the capacity to temporarily store water. They actually begin to saturate, the lower parts fully saturate, you get dramatic water level changes in these things. And then as they leak this water off, we have the ideal transient storage type phenomenon. It may take them weeks to months to leak their water off. Now, in some cases, we have a situation that looks more like this, and this situation turns out to be rather common for Wyoming. Here will be something like the Madison Aquifer. And the Madison Aquifer will be saturated up to the rim of the basin. So this is the zone of saturation. And we'll have a well-developed epicarst zone above that zone of saturation. And the precipitation and melt events will recharge that epicarst, and that epicarst will in turn produce delayed recharge into the aquifer. We'll be saturating this zone up here, but it'll be separated from the saturated zone that comprises the Madison Aquifer. And this thing will inflate and deflate on a seasonal basis. The interconnection between these two can be deep-seated karst networks, in other words, through-going caves that actually go upward and drain this area, or they could be through fracture zones or even linkage through permeable beds. But at any rate, what's peculiar about this is, of course, is that you have a saturated zone up here, a temporally saturated zone that is hydraulically separated from the main aquifer by an unsaturated, low permeable zone in many cases. It's kind of an interesting situation. Now this thing has been a nuisance to people working in provinces like Wyoming, because what they'll commonly do is measure water levels associated with this aquifer, and the types of water levels that commonly get picked up are the elevations of springs or the elevations of streams that cross these things, and they'll use those elevations as potentiometric levels associated with the Madison Aquifer. And in many cases, these potentiometric levels are at a minimum hundreds of feet too high or even thousands of feet too high. And we've seen that develop along the Bighorn Basin. I've actually been trapped in that particular snare myself. At any rate, that's life. What I thought you might like to do is see some slides that illustrate some of these points. And what I'm going to do with the slides is I'll start by showing you the flow-through end member, then we'll look at a pulse-through system, and then we'll look at the more typical combination systems that have both pulse-through and flow-through phenomena operating at the same time. But I'm going to stick strictly with karst because this is an area where you can actually see these things a lot more readily. And what I'm going to do is, of course, incorporate the stuff that Mills got out of his thesis area very briefly for you. I'll take you to some other interesting places around the globe to see some similar phenomena. And I'll show you some slides from China. I think you're going to be convinced that in China this is a real big issue, and of course they've been devoting a lot of effort to it for a number of centuries. So why don't we take a look at these slides?
Just one, yeah. Oh, there you go.
Okay, can we get them all off?
Pull the screen.
Somebody get those ones in the back.
I think, let's see if it'll work like this.
Yeah, when we get to the slides.
Or I'll get them. Yeah, I'll get them.
Okay. All set?
Yep.
What I'd like to start with is some flow-through systems that we've looked at on the west flank of the Bighorn Range. And the area that we're looking at up here is just east of Hyattville in the Medicine Lodge drainage area. And what we've got there are a series of caves that go right down the flank of the range. And they are clearly flow-through systems, as I'll be able to show you. This is a topographic map showing the setting. These little squares, of course, are sections. And what we've shown on this thing are 3 vectors. And what these are cave systems that have been traced as far as 6 miles down the range that some of them have actually been traversed for the entire distance. And we're looking at large recharge events occurring here where the dots are and the water discharging from springs down here. Clearly these things are pulse through. The hydraulic pulse, the recharge pulse, hits the sink area, travels down gradient, and when it comes out the spring, the pulse arrives at the spring exactly at the same time as the flood or the water, this season's water. Here's the recharge area for one of these. This is a thing called the Trapper Sinks. This is one of my classes in there, suffering through a small snowstorm. But this thing accepts small amounts of water. I've never hit it during a flood, but there it is, a little bit bigger flow. Nice little whirlpool here. And that drops into cave systems like this one. Clearly they're not saturated. Little sediment transport in these things. And there you see the water moving down gradient. You're about 3 miles down one of these systems on a traverse. I'm not having a lot of luck getting this to focus.
The top. Yeah, right there.
That thing doesn't back up. Can somebody put their hand on it?
There you go.
There we go. There's a good flood coming down there. That'll sharpen up really well.
So you're 3 miles down?
Yeah, this is about 4 miles down. I'm not in that. And here's a guy about a half a mile from the spring downstream. And obviously these are flow-through systems. During the peak discharge, this thing will be completely flooded with water. And we've found sticks and logs jammed in these 30 and 40 feet up cracks inside them. So they really do have a pulse that goes through. Okay, this is from China. That'll sharpen up really well. And what you're clearly seeing here is another simple pulse-through system. You're looking at a river going in a cave, and incidentally, that's the height of the cave. And there you're looking at the water coming out several miles later, and same muddy water. Pulse-through type systems, but on a much larger scale. Now what I'd like to do is take you out to John's thesis area. Let's see, yeah, we'll go out to, we won't go out to John's thesis area. What I'd like to do is take you out to Afton and look at a pulse-through system, at least the system that we currently think is a pulse-through system. And I think you'll find this kind of interesting. Here's the spring that discharges from the system of interest. This is a thing called periodic spring, which is a spring that supplies the town of Afton. This spring, incidentally, has the unique phenomenon of being able to shut on and off as the cycle goes through. It comes on for about 10 minutes and then goes off for 10 minutes, or 20 minutes, depending on the season. But at any rate, if we look down at a map of the range that supplies this spring, we have a Madison recharge area off here on the east side of the Salt River Range. We have some Madison outcrops in a canyon east of Afton right here. Groundwater recharge infiltrating this part of the uplift flows down through a syncline in the Madison Aquifer, climbs out at the periodic anticline, flows along the anticline, and discharges through the spring. This distance here is approximately 6 miles. I think a cross-section will bring this out for you a little bit more. There's a cross-section showing a thing. This is one of Jim Coogan's cross-sections, incidentally. This is the flow system as we understand it today. It would be the Madison Aquifer. And what you're looking at is about a 6-mile flow path down through a syncline, where the syncline reaches depths of about 6,000 feet below the land surface. Now, clearly what's going on in this particular situation is that when we have a big recharge event up here in the spring, it adds hydraulic head to the system, and we have piston pumping through the system, or traveling of the hydraulic head through the system, and it pushes water out of storage here that comes out the spring. So a seasonal fluctuation at this location in hydraulic head causes a seasonal fluctuation at the spring, and new water is going into storage here and displacing old water that's leaving there. And of course, we may be looking at water that could be decades to centuries old coming out on a downstream end. So this appears to be a classic pulse-through system. We're going to test that this summer, we hope. All right, that's the downstream end of this system. That'll sharpen up. This is Jim Coogan, and this is the intake works for the Afton water supply, and all you're seeing coming out this thing is the overflow. When this thing is really flowing, it's running at about 100 cubic feet per second. Now, I'd like to take you to the Grand Canyon for an example of a combination system. In the Grand Canyon region, people are impressed with the hole, but a hydrologist sees this huge plateau network extending away from the canyon. And what we have is karst systems that drain these plateaus. Let me give you an idea of the magnitude of that. We'll take a look at this with a satellite photo. Here's a satellite photo looking down on the eastern Grand Canyon. This is Marble Canyon here, and the eastern Grand Canyon right there. This is the South Rim Village and the North Rim Village right there. And this is the Kaibab Plateau extending up to the north. And what you see here, the dark, is a forest. At any rate, there are large fault zones that trend through the plateau and along the side of it, and these have been karstified at the level of the Madison limestone. And they discharge to huge springs down in the Grand Canyon. When they have a large precipitation event on the plateau, part of the water goes directly into fault zones and gets right into the karst system and comes out as floods. And we have flow-through events occurring. Most of the water, though, simply infiltrates into the plateau and recharges aquifers, displacing water out the low end, and we have pulse-through events. So we have a combination of pulse-through and flow-through, and I'd like to emphasize in the next couple of slides the pulse-through components of the system. These are the types of springs that are fed by that system. This is a thing called Thunder River, and the flow on this thing ranges up to about 100 cubic feet per second. For a scale, that's about 120 feet high. All right, these are the precipitation and discharge records taken from a typical spring that discharges from these types of systems. And what you notice is that on a precipitation record, we have a bimodal system. We have our winter precipitation event here, and then we have summer cyclonic storms here. And you'll notice that the discharge has only one peak, and that peak is displaced from the precipitation peak by a month or more. And what we're seeing is this hydraulic pulse here, represented by the winter storms, showing up as discharge a month or so later. This particular peak here, the precipitation that occurred during the summer, disappears from the region through evapotranspiration, so it doesn't even show up. But at any rate, what we're looking at here is the pulse-through phenomenon. And what this is about a 15-year average from the existing record. So it's a smooth average response of this system. Now, superimposed on top of this will be flash flood events that come right through the cave, and they average out in the long run. This is inside one of those caves. You're about 3/4 mile in Thunder River. And what this guy is, the most of the water that he's floating on here is ancient water leaving the system on a downgrading end. It's being lost from storage as new water is going into storage. But part of the water he's floating on, of course, could be floodwaters coming directly through as a flow-through event. That'll give you a magnitude of what the spring discharges at a low flow stage. All right, now here's another combination system. You're over in South China. This is one of the grandest karst areas in the world. And everything you're looking at here, maybe you can focus this part up. Everything you're looking at here is drained through the subsurface. And underlying these valleys are karst river systems, and they have tremendous volumes, thousands of cubic feet per second for the largest of them. And of course, the area is getting a couple hundred inches of rain a year, so we're really talking about a lot of water. And all the topography you're looking at here is closed. There is no superficial outlet. And I'll show you the scale of the closures in a moment. But at any rate, what we're relying on is epikarst storage in these tower karst features and flow-through events through the open system. So if we get precipitation on here, large amounts of the precipitation go into storage in these towers and are leaked out of the epikarst to the larger drain system, and then out it goes. So these systems respond both to flow-through and pulse-through phenomena. This is another picture in the same area. What we're looking down is not a valley, but a chain of sinkholes that have developed along some kind of a geologic limit. This is a typical closed basin That happens to be the rim of the dolina, or sinkhole, and you're looking at about 150 meters of topographic relief within this particular structure, and it's so large they're building houses down here and farming down. One of the problems they have is during the spring, these things will commonly flood from the bottom, and they'll drown them out. So it's a nuisance. Here's another one. This is our granddaddy. This is the closure from there down to there. You're looking at a dolina that's 450 meters deep. This is the deepest one that's been found in the world so far. And a village down there. Now this is one of the caves that drains that type of a network. And of course these are huge river systems. This particular river system has been followed for something like 50 or 60 kilometers by cave explorers. And they do it in parts. But at any rate, to give you an idea, there's a little houseboat for scale. There you are standing in the inside looking out. Fishermen, very prosaic. At any rate, the water level changes in these things during flow-through events can be on the order of several meters. And that gets pretty exciting for the folks that like to hang out there. Now, the Chinese have done a tremendous amount of work trying to characterize these systems. And one of the things that they've been trying to characterize is the epicar storage that takes place in these towers. And one of the leading guys that I've met that's worked on these is a fellow named Dioxin. And Dioxin has tried to use geochemical techniques to separate the flow-through components from the pulse-through components. In other words, what he's trying to do is separate this storm's water from the water coming out of storage from the larger systems. And I'll show you some of the ramifications of that. Here's a graph that he's published on this. What you see up here is a graph that shows precipitation events. Here's a 50 millimeter storm, for example. And down here is the discharge response from springs from those towers. You'll notice that a flood pulse went through that corresponded to that storm system. And what he's done is he studied the geochemistry to see how the geochemistry responds. And what he finds is he takes reasonably poor quality water. You're looking at calcium and oxygen 18 here. You take that and a flood comes through and it dilutes it and improves the quality. And when it improves the quality, what he can do is use that change to calculate the volume that came from the storm and the volume that came out of long-term storage underneath the tower. And this technique is being used rather widely. Here is that researcher. Now, similar work has been undertaken by a woman named Shirley Dries here in the States. This is data that she's collected at Merrimack Spring in Missouri. And what you see here is, once again, precipitation events, discharge. She's been heavily influenced by these Chinese. Look at these awful units. But at any rate, what you can notice is that the Merrimack Spring discharge responds perfectly to precipitation events. The flow changes dramatically. You're looking at going from 0.5 to 1.5 cubic meters per second. Cubic meter, don't forget, is 27 cubic feet per second plus, right? So we're talking about a lot of water. But anyway, what she's done is she's related this to signals in calcium, magnesium, major ion signals. And they've also done the same thing for delta 18, same as dioxin. But anyway, what they see is these fabulous correlations. And what you're seeing here is the dilution. This thing here would represent water coming out of storage, and dilution by fresh water entering the system through a flow-through phenomenon. So we've got a mixed system, and what she's attempting to do here is utilize these raw data to separate the components of the signal, the flow-through and the pulse-through components. And she's using signal theory to do this, and there's a couple of graduate students now working under me and Dr. Drever who will be attempting to utilize similar techniques for springs here in Wyoming. There's Shirley. She's the one that we're talking about. This is her husband. These are just a couple of tourists. I wanted to rip this guy's t-shirt off. Really a great t-shirt. Okay, now in Wyoming, when we start talking about transient storage, names like John Mills come right to mind, because he got in here and slugged it out and started defining these things in a very real way. And what we're concerned about in Wyoming is these blocks of rock like these two here that are uplifted relative to the regional aquifers in the basins. And these things have the capacity to put large amounts of groundwater into storage and leak them out. They can leak them out directly over barren outcrops into the basins, or they can leak them out over the recharge area of the main aquifer. But at any rate, as I mentioned before, the primary thing that we're interested in as hydrologists is that these things give the system additional capacitance, and it lengthens the recharge season, or it lengthens the stream flow season. And I'd like to show you some of this stuff in the flesh. This is John's thesis area. It was the southern part of the Gros Ventre Range over in the Jackson area. And here's the picture looking down on his thesis area. He had to start at about 6,000 feet and climb up to 10 or 12,000 to collect data every time he went out. I thought it was very appropriate. At any rate, what you're looking at here is the Paleozoic carbonate section, and as you can see, it's very well drained. And this is the type of block that we're particularly interested in. Here's a diagrammatic cross-section through that same range, and this shows the Madison Aquifer right here. And this is a transient storage area. Groundwater infiltrates here, circulates down, and discharges from springs down. Great. And this is the type of thing we're interested in. In addition, we're interested in the capacitance of these blocks as transient storage devices, which would leak water down to these kinds of systems. Now, this is a typical spring that comes out in John's thesis area, and what you're looking at is the early to mid runoff period, which would be late spring, maybe June or July. And here's the same place in the fall. There's a trickle coming out here, but that's it. And this is very characteristic of these things. Many of these springs are completely ephemeral. A typical setting in John's thesis area was this one, where he had a large transient storage zone that lay directly above the saturated regional aquifer. And what would happen is that the down gradient spring would be drawing all year long from storage in the main aquifer. But in addition, we would get a transient storage event, and then it would start leaking into this aquifer, and part of that flow would show up at this spring as a flow-through phenomenon. So we were looking at a mixed system. And I'll show you some of the records that John developed to illustrate that. But first, let's take a look at the analog for that last drawing. Here's the system we're looking at. He hiked all over this place. And this is a close-up of it. What he found was a very permeable epicard zone up here, and that was connected by vertical caves down to at least this depth here. He never was able to enter them. And then the water would flow out here. And what he wanted to do is develop techniques for separating the flow as best as possible. This is a spring that discharges from that system we just showed you during the flood. And there it is in the off-season. This is a late winter picture when everything up in the highlands is frozen up. That's John's. Now these are the types of records that he got out of it. What you're looking at here is the discharge of the spring system. And of course, like the others I showed you, it led to a drop in temperature, and it also led to a drop in total dissolved solids. So using the techniques that Dioxin and Dries are developing, we can probably separate this spring into its components. What made this system particularly interesting is that the deep groundwater system was at a high temperature, a little over 55 degrees. So that when we diluted it with the recharge waters out of transient storage, which were running around 30 to 35 degrees, we could see a measurable change in the temperature. Okay, this is one of the upstream parts of the system, and what you're looking at is a surface stream going right down a sinkhole. And there's another creek that something's happened to that creek. John did something here. But anyway, what he's trying to do is see how long it takes for the flow-through component to go through the system. And what he found is that a dye trace like this would show up in the downstream springs, a vertical drop of 1,500 to 2,000 feet and a lateral distance of 3 to 5 miles. It'd show up in a matter of hours. That's how permeable the open channels were. Okay, now, the main thing that John got into up there, though, was these epicars. And what he's diagrammatically shown you is an epicar sitting in, disconnected from the Madison Aquifer underneath it. And the epicars puts groundwater into storage like so, and that water either leaks out directly down through cave systems into the Madison, or it flows out springs, flows over the outcrop of the Madison and seeps in, or it can accumulate in ponds. We'll show you examples of each of these. There's a typical photograph of John's thesis area. What I'll do is take you progressively closer to the ground so you can get a feel for this epicar's permeability. There you're getting down there. This picture's on the order of a half a mile wide. What you see is a limestone that's riven with solution features, little cracks and joints, numerous sinkholes. Let's get a little closer. There you are on the ground surface. Here's an aerial photo for scale. And every joint and fracture is dissolved out, giving you tremendous permeability. Now, the thing that this does, as you can see, is it allows for very ready infiltration of any waters that get there. The recharge in these areas is virtually 100%. The only thing you're losing is water that's evaporated. And, of course, going down with it is all the soil. Here's a close-up. These things are highly permeable. This happens to be in Tosi Basin. What you're looking at is a stripped surface of the Madison limestone, and it's very clearly karstified. But the thing that's interesting is this is the Mississippian paleokarst that's been exhumed, and it's being redissolved and reactivated. And these things here are sinkholes that date from Mississippian time, 320 million years ago, and they're filled in with Amsden formation. As you get closer to the ground, this is what they look like. I have trees for scale here, but that's an old Mississippian sinkhole that's been filled in, buried. Now it's all been stripped off and it's being reactivated. But you can see that we get a fabulously developed epicar zone developed in this particular area. There's a ground shot of the same thing, just showing you the fine detail of the epicars. Okay, one interesting thing that John found in a number of places, and we're finding this in the Salt River Range, are internally drained lakes. These are lakes with no outlets except at the highest flood stages. And commonly what will happen is that some epicar zones will drain to these lakes, or these lakes will sit in the middle of the epicars. But at any rate, these things fill up during the spring, and then all in the late spring and during the summer, they leak water, not to the surface water system, but down into the aquifers, and create terrific recharge basins. Let's show you an example of one of these. Here you see a lake that's partially filled, and you're looking downstream. That's the topographic divide. The thing would have to fill up to that level to spill out, and as you can see from the forest, it's not doing it very often. There's a late spring shot, so a lot of water is leaked out of this already. Here's a fall shot of the same place. It's entirely internal drainage. And all we're looking at is infiltration down through fractured limestone to the aquifer. And up in this reach here, this lake is fed by epicarst drainage. Here you are in France. We're 2.5 kilometers from the Spanish border. And what I'd like to do is show you some fantastic karst that exists in the Pyrenees. This is the type of terrain we're looking at in the Pyrenees. Carbonate sequences. Clearly these things are largely out of the zone of saturation for regional aquifers, but they're mantled by this epicarst phenomenon. This is a beautiful pass in France that right here is the French-Spanish border. We're in Spain looking towards France. And the rocks in this pass are particularly beautiful, so we might take a look at some of those, and so I'll get you there. Here you're hiking along a trail out of Spain, and France is right on the other side. We'll stop right in here, and you can see some real nice rocks. Look at those fantastic rocks. Now you're looking the other way into Spain, trying to focus your camera. And what you're looking at is a terrain that looks identical to what Mills had in his thesis area. Strip limestone surfaces. Everything is drained to solution cavities. This is a huge dolina. All these things are sinkholes and pits and vertical shafts. And very thick epicar zone here, probably extending down on the order of several meters to several hundred meters. Barren limestones. And this is what they look like when you get close to them. Every joint, every bedding plane, everything imaginable has dissolution on it. Now, for scale, if you were standing there, you'd be about that tall. This is a little close-up of it, looking at some pretty flowers. There's a guide for scale showing you the vertical relief on that stuff. Now, part of the storage that's going on in this particular location is ice and snow going down in these things and melting out in the late season. And cave explorers that go down in these systems prefer the season when they're frozen up because there's no water moving in the systems below them. So what they do is they drop out here and dig down through the snow to the shafts and go down the shafts in the wintertime instead of the summertime. This is in China. This is the Chinese character for cave. It's pronounced dong. And you see it everywhere over there because the Chinese highly revere their caves. This happens to be Xu Zia Ken, and he was a famous geomorphologist who was active in China doing 1960 work in the Western world in the year 1400. And of course, at that time, the Europeans were taking off the loincloths from the Dark Ages, right? At any rate, China's been very active in this thing. The maps that this guy's made of the karst systems are accurate and still used to this day, and they're quite proud of it. This happens to be a statue in front of the Karst Institute, which is a federal agency down in Guilin in the southern part of China. All right, this is the type of karst that Ken was studying. This is the famous tower karst of South China. It's very exotic. Europeans couldn't believe it existed until they started getting in there, and this stuff is very common. It covers a couple 100,000 square miles in China alone. Puerto Rico is largely made up of the same thing, for example, but on a much smaller scale. Now, as I mentioned before, the Chinese are very interested in these towers as transient storage devices. Of course, they use them for anything. They like to quarry them, and that's how we've gotten a lot of information. When they quarry these things, what they commonly do is quarry them with a pick and shovel, which means that they simply remove the epikarst outer zone, and you get to see what's underneath. And that's really worthwhile. I'll show you some slides of these things in typical settings. It's a three-dimensional thing. They cover the whole place. You're near Guilin, China here. What you're looking at is a highly karstified surface. You see hundreds of small holes and dissolved out joints. Much better than you see in the Pyrenees or in Wyoming. But the effect is the same. This is a veneer of karst on an otherwise mostly solid tower. And in some of these towers, there are penetrating caves that serve as sort of regional drains. But for the most part, the water is migrating through the epicarst to springs at the base of the hill, where it flows out into the pastures before sinking into the regional systems. Here you're up in the towers, just to give you an idea of what they look like to climb around in them. Everything is, this is a little sinkhole, for example. Everything is internally drained. Here's more of it. There's a big one. If you'll look at this closely, you'll notice that the bedding is oriented at about 45 or more degrees off to the side. The towers form regardless of the dip and regardless of the structure. They're completely independent. Oops, missed one here. Let's see if we can get it. You're not going to get the last one.
There's some more after.
You have some more, Peter.
Okay, well, okay, did I get it? Okay, here we go. Let me go back to that last one. This one's fairly well exposed. Here you've got horizontal bedding and very well developed epicarst, and here you see a lot of little caves that are penetrating the tower at this particular location. All right, I thought you might get a kick out of seeing some fabulously developed epicarst. This is a thing called the Stone Forest over by Kunming. Kunming was the big B-29 base in China that we used to feed during the Second World War, and so a lot of Americans have been over here. At any rate, that's the Stone Forest. It just goes for miles like this. For a scale, there's a bunch of people standing in a pavilion. Spectacular development. But it's hard for you to get an idea of scale. If that were in this room, it would be up to the 3rd floor. See the guide for scale? They make these walkways so you can wander around inside this thing. Hardly ever get a good view out. This is in the karst area. What you're seeing is night fishermen on the river. This is the Lee River near Guilin. And these birds are tied to the little boat. And they jump off the boat and catch fish, but they put a big ring around their neck so they can't swallow them. They bring them back on and take the fish away from them. And they do that all night long. And then after daybreak, they feed them. Okay, that's all we have. Any questions?
Any questions, Peter?
Okay.
Hey, thank you very much.